Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. With the whole world watching the situation in Ukraine,
Yeah.
there are a lot of questions swirling around,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to the whole mobilization thing.
Right.
And that's exactly what we are going to unpack today.
Okay.
We've got some really fascinating material to dig into.
Sounds good.
We'll be looking at a blog post from Simplicious's Garden of Knowledge,
Interesting.
generating quite a bit of buzz.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Plus, we've got some additional comments that really add fuel to the fire.
Oh, wow. This is going to be good.
So buckle up and get ready to dive in.
All right, let's do it.
This isn't just your average military strategy analysis.
No, it's not.
It's a whole tangled mess of politics and global power plays, and even ideology is thrown in there.
Absolutely.
There's so much speculation going on
Yeah.
about what a second Trump presidency will actually mean,
Right.
not just for this conflict,
Yeah.
but potentially for the whole future world order.
It's a big deal.
It is.
It really is.
And this blog post we're looking at, well, it jumps right into some really intense claims.
No. Like what?
Especially about the pressure that's being put on Zelensky
Okay.
to increase mobilization in Ukraine.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's been in the headlines a lot lately.
It has.
What?
And it's not just any officials pushing for this either.
Oh.
We're talking about serious heavy hitters here,
Oh, really?
like Mike Waltz,
Okay.
who's slated to be Trump's national security advisor.
Yeah.
And even Jake Sullivan is on board.
No, wow.
They're both advocating for Zelensky to actually lower the draft age all the way down to 18.
18. That's young.
Yeah.
Seriously.
It is.
I mean, on the surface, it seems like it's all about boosting Ukraine's manpower,
Yeah.
just getting more boots on the ground.
Right.
But some analysts are kind of reading between the lines here.
I was going to say, what do you make of all this? Complicated.
Isn't it always?
Yeah.
So go on. Well, the blog author is suggesting that
Yeah.
this push to lower the draft age,
Yeah.
it might be a tactic to actually weaken Zelensky's position
Interesting.
in any kind of negotiations,
Yeah.
Basically setting the stage for a U.S.-Russia deal
Okay.
that ends up benefiting Russia.
And more than Ukraine.
Yeah, more than Ukraine.
I mean, that's a pretty intense theory,
It is.
and I'm not sure I entirely buy it.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think it's really important to consider all the angles here.
Mm-hmm.
While that scenario is possible,
Yeah.
we should also look at what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine.
Point.
You know what I mean?
I do.
And according to some internal sources that are cited in the blog,
Okay.
the current mobilization efforts are falling way short of their goals.
Oh, really?
Like, way short.
Wow.
Apparently, the 2024 plan is only at 25% completion.
25%?
That's not good.
Not good at all.
No, it's not. And on top of that, there are reports of growing resentment toward military personnel within Ukrainian society.
It sounds like Zelensky's being squeezed from all sides.
Yeah, he is.
So on the one hand, you've got this international pressure
Right.
to escalate the war effort.
Exactly.
And on the other hand, you've got a population that's
Yeah.
growing increasingly weary of the conflict
Mm-hmm.
and resistant to further mobilization.
It's a tough spot to be in.
Talk about being between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you've got Zelensky's own strategy to consider as well.
Right.
The blog post mentions that he's been prioritizing
Yeah.
the formation of these new reserve brigades.
Reserve brigades.
Yeah, it seems like they could be for future offensives,
Oh, okay.
or maybe even just for strategic PR.
Strategic PR.
Yeah, who knows?
Interesting.
But this has actually sparked some criticism
Really?
from some Ukrainian military officials
Huh.
who argue that those resources
Yeah.
should be going towards reinforcing the troops that are already on the front lines.
Right. The ones who are struggling to hold their ground. Exactly.
It makes sense when you put it like that.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's like trying to build a new house while
Yeah.
the one you're living in is falling apart.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It's very fitting.
What good is a reserve force
Yeah.
if you can't even maintain your current lines?
Exactly.
And the blog post doesn't shy away from the human cost of all of this either.
It doesn't.
There's this really chilling account from a Ukrainian soldier who describes his entire battalion,
Wow.
600 men, being completely wiped out
Oh, my goodness.
in just 5 days of fighting
5 days.
in Rabotino.
That's just,
Yeah,
it's heartbreaking.
it is.
It really drives home the brutal reality
It does.
of what's happening there.
It really does.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how Ukraine can even hope to replace
Right.
those experienced soldiers.
Especially with Russia's forces becoming more seasoned as the conflict goes on.
Exactly.
It just seems like a recipe for disaster.
And the blog post doesn't stop there. Really?
It actually goes on to delve into some theories about Trump's larger geopolitical ambitions,
Oh, this is getting interesting.
including this idea of a MAGA Monroe
A
doctrine.
MAGA Monroe doctrine.
Yeah.
What's that?
Well, the author suggests that Trump might be aiming to solidify U.S. dominance
Right.
in the Western Hemisphere,
Okay.
potentially even going so far as to try and purchase Greenland.
I know it sounds crazy.
Purchase Greenland?
I know.
Is that even a possibility?
Apparently there's been a bill proposed,
In the U.S. Congress?
yeah, by some Republicans
Wow.
to actually explore that idea.
Okay, so is that a serious proposal?
I don't know.
Or just political posturing?
Yeah, it's really hard to say.
It is, isn't it?
But the blog author connects this to this idea of Trump eventually negotiating a new global order
Okay.
with Russia.
With Russia?
Yeah,
So it's like a two-step plan.
I guess you could say that.
Secure the West first,
Right.
and then divvy up the rest of the world with Russia.
Something like that.
It's a bold strategy.
It is.
It really is.
And the blog goes on to suggest
Mm.
that this new world order could even see Russia
Yeah.
emerge as the ideological leader
The ideological leader
of what's known as the Global South.
of Global South.
It even cites a French philosopher,
Oh, real?
Luc Ferry,
Okay.
who has argued that Russia,
Yeah.
not China,
Okay.
could fill that role
Interesting.
in a multipolar world.
Multipolar world. What exactly does that mean?
Well, essentially, it means a world where power isn't concentrated
Uh-huh.
in one dominant nation,
Okay.
but it's spread across multiple centers of influence.
I see.
So instead of a unipolar world
Yeah.
dominated by the U.S.,
Right.
you'd have several major players
Okay.
calling the shots.
Got it.
So in this scenario,
Yeah.
the conflict in Ukraine
Mm-hmm.
becomes this high-stakes battleground
Right.
where essentially Trump and Putin are trying to establish dominance
Right.
for this future world order. So that's why neither side can afford to back down,
Exactly.
because the stakes are so high.
the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah,
And it becomes less about Ukraine itself
right.
and more about who gets to shape
Yeah,
the global landscape.
in the coming decades.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we've got this really complex interplay of domestic pressures
Mhm.
and military realities
Right.
and these grand geopolitical theories.
I'm already feeling a little overwhelmed.
I know it's a lot to take in.
It is.
But before we dive further into the blog's analysis, let's take a step back
Okay.
and make sure we're all on the same page
All right.
about some of these terms.
Okay.
You mentioned Global South
Right.
and multipolar world.
Yeah.
Can we just unpack those a little bit more?
Sure.
I think it'd be helpful for our listeners
Mhm.
to have a clearer understanding
Makes
of
sense.
what those concepts actually mean.
Yeah, good point. It's important to define our terms.
Yeah.
So, Global South is a term that's often used to describe the regions of Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Oceania.
So it's a very broad term,
Is a broad term.
encompassing a lot of different cultures,
Yeah.
economies,
Mhm.
political systems.
Exactly.
And what about multipolar world?
So a multipolar world
Yeah.
is one where power is distributed among multiple major players.
Okay.
So in a unipolar world,
Right.
like the one we've arguably had since the end of the Cold War,
Right.
there's one dominant power.
The United States.
Exactly, the United States.
Yeah.
And they exert significant influence.
On global affairs.
Yes. But in a multipolar world,
Okay.
you'd have several major powers.
So like the U.S.,
Potentially
China, Russia,
Russia for sure.
maybe even the European Union.
Yeah, possible.
All competing for influence
Exactly.
and shaping the global agenda.
Right. So it's a much more decentralized world.
That sounds a lot more unpredictable, too.
It does, doesn't it?
And potentially more unstable.
Yeah. And that could lead to more conflict,
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
more competition, more friction between those major powers.
Yeah, but it could also create opportunities for
Right,
cooperation
yeah.
and new alliances.
Absolutely. As nations try to navigate this shifting balance of power.
So it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. It just depends
Yeah.
on how these different powers choose to interact with each other.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole discussion so fascinating. You
Yeah.
know, we're potentially witnessing a major shift
In the global order.
in the global order, and it's impossible to say for sure how it will all play out.
It really is.
But by understanding the key concepts
Yeah,
and the players involved,
right.
we can start to make sense of the complexities and consider the potential implications.
For the future.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to pause for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground already,
We have.
but we've only just scratched the surface of this blog post.
There's still so much more to unpack.
There is.
Including the author's analysis of
Yeah.
the potential consequences of these mobilization pressures.
Right.
And, the feasibility of Ukraine actually meeting
Yeah.
these ambitious recruitment targets.
I'm curious about that.
Yeah.
And let's not forget those additional comments
Oh, yeah.
from readers that you mentioned.
Right.
I'm really curious to hear what they have to say about this whole situation.
Yeah, they offer some interesting perspectives.
Okay, well, we'll save all that for the next part of our deep dive,
Sounds good.
so stay tuned.
All right, we'll be right back.
All right, so before the break, we were talking about these huge geopolitical shifts and theories.
Yeah.
But this blog post also includes some comments from readers,
Right.
and they really add another dimension
Oh, yeah.
to the conversation. And one that really stood out to me
Okay.
was from someone named Julianne.
Julianne.
Yeah, and she suggests a totally different motivation
Oh.
behind this
Mm-hmm.
push for increased mobilization.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, Julianne argues that Russia and China
Mm-hmm.
actually benefit from the conflict dragging on.
Okay.
And this push for mobilization
Yeah.
might be a way for Western powers to kind of delay the inevitable.
The inevitable?
Yeah, while still appearing to support Ukraine.
Interesting.
It's a pretty cynical view,
It is.
but one worth exploring, I think.
Yeah. For sure.
So basically what Julianne is saying
Uh-huh.
is that the West is using mobilization
Okay.
as a Band-Aid solution,
A Band-Aid solution.
hoping to buy time
Okay.
while they figure out a more permanent strategy.
It's a pretty bleak assessment,
It is.
but does it hold any weight?
Well, the blog post itself actually quotes NATO head Mark Rutte,
Okay.
and he seems to be pretty frustrated
Okay.
with the pace of Western military production
I see.
compared to Russia's.
Yeah, that makes sense.
He even says that Russia's producing more in 3 months
3 months.
than all of NATO combined produces in a year.
Wow.
If that's true,
Yeah.
it paints a pretty alarming picture.
It does.
It could mean that Russia actually has the capacity
Right.
to sustain this conflict
Yeah.
for a lot longer than many initially thought.
That's a game changer.
And it plays right into Julianne's point.
Exactly.
She argues that the longer the war drags on,
Mm-hmm.
the more likely it is that Western support for Ukraine
Yeah.
will start to waver.
Especially if citizens in those countries
Right.
start feeling the economic and social impacts.
Of a prolonged conflict.
Yeah. Nobody wants that.
So is she suggesting that this push for increased mobilization
Okay.
is just a way to appease public opinion in the West,
Interesting.
while quietly preparing for the possibility
Yeah.
of a negotiated settlement
Mm-hmm.
that might not be entirely favorable to Ukraine?
It's possible.
It is.
That's one way to interpret it.
right.
But remember, it's just one perspective
Of course.
among many.
Right.
We also have to consider the voices within Ukraine itself.
Good point.
The blog post includes this really interesting video clip from a Kharkiv deputy
Okay.
who argues that Ukraine is simply running out of soldiers.
It's running out of soldiers.
Yeah, and he calls for Zelensky
Okay.
to be upfront with the Ukrainian people
About
the reality of their dwindling manpower.
It sounds like he's advocating for a more honest conversation
Yeah, I think so.
about the limitations of Ukraine's military capabilities.
Which seems to contradict the narrative
Yeah.
coming from some Western officials.
We're pushing for Ukraine to keep fighting.
No matter the cost.
Yeah.
He even goes so far as to say that victory is impossible
Wow.
without significant outside intervention.
So it really further complicates the issue.
Yeah, it does, because it seems like everyone has a different idea of what the end game should be.
Right, and how to get there.
Yeah.
This whole deep dive really highlights
Yeah.
the conflicting narratives surrounding this conflict.
It's hard to know what to believe.
It really is.
But let's try to stay focused on the facts.
Mm.
We were talking about the feasibility of Ukraine meeting these increased mobilization targets. Right. But the blog post actually casts serious doubt on that.
Right, there were those insider reports
Yeah.
suggesting that the number of potential recruits
Right.
might be much lower.
Much lower than previously thought.
Yeah.
One report claimed the pool of men aged 18 to 25
Okay.
is far smaller than initial estimates.
Wow.
And even if Zelensky were to lower the draft age,
Right.
it might not make a significant difference.
If there simply aren't enough.
Yeah, if there just aren't enough eligible men left.
It's a tragic situation.
It is.
The war has already taken such a heavy toll.
On Ukraine's population.
And now we're talking about potentially sending
Yeah.
even younger men into battle.
It's heartbreaking.
It is.
The blog post even cites a Russian source
Okay.
that estimates Ukraine would be lucky
Yeah.
to recruit 30,000 to 40,000 new soldiers per year,
Per year.
even with the lower draft age.
But we've already heard accounts of entire battalions being wiped out in a matter of days.
It's hard to comprehend.
Those recruitment numbers seem paltry
Yeah.
in comparison to the potential losses.
It raises the question,
Yeah.
is throwing more bodies at the problem?
Especially inexperienced ones.
Right.
Really a viable solution.
The blog author seems to be arguing that it's not.
Yeah. Seems that way.
He suggests that Ukraine needs to find a more sustainable approach to the war.
If they hope to achieve any kind of favorable outcome,
Right.
he doesn't really offer any concrete alternatives, though.
He doesn't.
But he does imply that a change in strategy is necessary.
Okay, so given all these challenges, the pressure from the West,
Yeah.
the dwindling manpower,
Yeah.
the conflicting narratives,
And the lack of a clear path forward.
is there any hope for Ukraine?
Is there any way out of this seemingly impossible situation?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And honestly, I don't have a definitive answer. It's tempting to fall into despair.
I understand.
When you look at the sheer scale of the challenges.
I agree. It's hard to remain optimistic
It is.
when you hear about those devastating losses
Yeah.
and these seemingly insurmountable odds.
But I think it's crucial to resist the urge to oversimplify the situation.
Right.
You know, the blog post presents a fairly binary view
Right.
with either Trump or Putin coming out on top.
But I believe there are more possibilities,
Yeah.
more nuances,
Absolutely.
and perhaps even some glimmers of hope.
Okay. I like that thinking outside the binary.
Right.
So what might some of these alternative scenarios look like
Yeah. What are the potential paths forward?
that we might be overlooking?
Let's explore those possibilities
Okay.
in the next part of our deep dive.
Right.
Perhaps by examining some of the less obvious factors at play,
Yeah.
we can start to imagine a different future for Ukraine.
Okay.
One that doesn't necessarily end in utter defeat.
I'm definitely eager to hear your thoughts on that.
This deep dive has been a roller coaster of information and emotions.
Yeah.
But I'm holding on to hope
I think that's the right approach.
that we can find some reason for optimism
Yeah.
amidst all the chaos and uncertainty.
Hope is essential,
It is.
especially when dealing with such a complex and challenging situation.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about all these pressures on Ukraine,
Yeah.
the grim realities on the ground,
Mhm.
and, all these potential global power shifts
Yeah.
looming in the background.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
And honestly, it can feel pretty discouraging.
It really can.
But before we wrap up this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts
Okay.
on what a way forward might actually look like.
Is there any light at the end of this tunnel?
Well, I think it's important to remember
Okay.
that even in the darkest of times,
Yeah.
there are always possibilities
Okay.
we might not immediately see.
Right.
The blog post we've been discussing
Yeah.
paints a pretty bleak picture, focusing on this win-lose scenario.
Between Trump and Putin.
Exactly.
Right.
But the world is rarely that simple.
It's not.
There could be other outcomes,
Okay.
other paths forward
Yeah.
that haven't even been considered yet.
So let's ditch that binary thinking
Okay.
and try to envision some alternative scenarios.
Right.
What might those look like?
Well, one possibility is that internal pressure
Okay.
within Russia
Mm-hmm.
could actually force Putin to reevaluate his strategy.
Okay, so we've already seen some signs of dissent
Right.
within Russia regarding the war.
Yeah. And if the conflict continues to drain resources
Uh-huh.
and claim lives,
Yeah.
those voices could become much louder
Right.
and more difficult for Putin to ignore.
That's a good point.
It is.
We tend to focus so much on the actions
Yeah.
of these leaders like Putin and Zelensky,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not operating in a vacuum.
Right. They're influenced by so many things.
The internal politics,
Yeah.
economic factors.
Public opinion.
Right. All of those things can have a ripple effect.
Absolutely.
And it's also possible that the global landscape could shift
Right.
in ways that create new opportunities
Okay.
for negotiation and compromise.
Like what?
Well, for example, If China were to distance itself from Russia,
Okay.
that could significantly weaken Putin's position
Yeah.
and make him more open to a negotiated settlement.
So we're talking about potential cracks
Yeah.
in the existing power structures.
That could open up space for new possibilities.
Exactly.
Okay, I like the way you're thinking.
And let's not forget the potential role
Okay.
of international organizations
Right.
and diplomatic efforts.
Yeah, like the UN.
The UN, for example,
Yeah.
could play a more active role in mediating negotiations
It could.
and pushing for a peaceful resolution.
It seems like those efforts have been pretty stalled lately, though.
They have.
Is there any reason to think that they might gain some traction in the future?
Well, as the human cost of this war continues to mount and the global economic and political consequences become more severe,
Right.
there's likely to be increased pressure from all sides
Yeah.
to find a way out of this impasse.
So maybe, just maybe,
Yeah.
the sheer desperation of the situation will force people to be more creative,
I hope so.
more willing to compromise,
Yeah.
even if those compromises seem unthinkable right now.
Right.
So circling back to our deep dive today,
Okay.
what are some of the key takeaways?
All right. Well, first and foremost, I hope they'll come away with an appreciation for the complexity of this situation.
It's easy to get caught up
It is.
in those simplistic narratives
Yeah.
and binary thinking.
But the reality is far more nuanced.
It is.
You know, there are multiple perspectives,
Right.
conflicting agendas, and a whole web of interconnected factors
Yeah.
influencing the course of this conflict.
And I think it's so important for listeners to understand
Yeah.
that this mobilization issue in Ukraine
Yeah.
is about so much more than just numbers.
Exactly.
It's about morale,
Yeah.
strategy,
Global power dynamic.
ideology.
All those threads are kind of interwoven
They are.
in a way that makes simple solutions
Yeah.
almost impossible.
And I also hope that listeners will come away
Yeah.
with a deeper understanding
Okay.
of the human cost of this war.
That Ukrainian soldier's story
Yeah.
about losing nearly his entire battalion.
It's just heartbreaking.
It's a stark reminder
It is.
that behind the headlines
Right.
and the geopolitical maneuvering,
Yeah.
there are real people
Real people
whose lives are being irrevocably altered.
by this conflict.
Yeah.
That's a point that can't be overstated.
It can.
It's easy to get lost in these abstract discussions of
Yeah.
strategy and power.
But we can never forget that this war is being fought by
Yeah.
real people.
Who are enduring unimaginable suffering.
Exactly. And finally,
Yeah.
I hope listeners will be inspired to continue exploring this issue on their own.
To delve deeper into the different perspectives
Yeah.
and potential solutions,
This deep dive is just a starting point.
a jumping off point.
Yeah, for further inquiry and reflection.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
We've laid out a lot to think about,
We have.
but the real learning happens
right?
when you, our listeners,
Yeah.
engage with these ideas,
Oh, right,
draw
right.
your own conclusions.
And who knows?
Maybe.
Maybe you'll be the one
Yeah.
to come up with that third option
That innovative
that
solution.
no one else has thought of yet.
That's what we love about you, our listeners.
Always thinking.
Yeah, always pushing the boundaries.
So on that note,
Keep those brains buzzing.
and we'll catch you next time.
For another deep dive.